everyone for coming together tonight to join Orca Books Co-op to celebrate Dean Spade's text, Mutual Aid, Building Solidarity During This Crisis and the Next. You're in for a wonderful reading and discussion tonight. The event is being recorded, so please keep that in mind. There will be an opportunity for questions toward the end of the hour, so hold on to any questions that you would like answered. So thank you so much to the Lamplighters for graciously hosting us tonight. And thank you to our camera person, Miranda, for her countless hours of work. And of course, thank you, Dean, for coming down to Olympia to share some of your knowledge and wisdom. Dean Spade has been working to build queer and trans liberation based in racial and economic justice for the past 2 decades. He's the author of Normal Life, Administrative Violence, Critical Trans Politics, and the Limits of Law, the director of the documentary Pinkwashing Exposed, Seattle Fights Back, and the creator of the Mutual Aid Toolkit at BigDoorBrigade.com. His latest book, Mutual Aid, Building Solidarity During This Crisis and the Next, was published by Verso Press in October 2020. Mutual Aid provides a grassroots theory and practical tools of mutual aid to support people to survive crisis conditions, to prepare for coming disasters, and to build vibrant social movements that can tackle the root causes of crisis and disaster. So without further ado, Dean Spade.
Yeah, I don't ever really read from this book because, I don't know, I'd just rather talk about it a little bit and then have a conversation. Thank you so much for organizing this and for filming it and to the Lamplighters. Fun to be here in Olympia. Basically, you know, this book is just based on my own work for the last 20 years or so in social movements, mostly about queer and trans liberation and prison abolition, border abolition, anti-capitalism. And in doing that kind of work, you know, like mutual aid is just central to the work of all social movements. It's like no matter what you're doing, you're also doing mutual aid, because social movements are about crises, and there's always people in crisis, you know. In addition to like your aim to like get rid of the crisis altogether, you're also just always all working on supporting people who are trying to survive right now. And what that's looked like for me, like a lot of that has been direct support to people who are in U.S. prisons and detention centers, and a lot of work around people just getting through like the bureaucratic nonsense of being poor, like supporting people who are trying to get shelter in like New York City's like Byzantine shelter system for people with HIV/AIDS, or you know, like things like that. Just, you know, like going with people to meetings and appointments, harassing these bureaucracies to give people what they're supposed to give them on paper, which is already inadequate. So that's like the work I've been doing, you know, in different ways for a lot of years. For many years, not as a lawyer, and then later as a lawyer. And when Trump was elected in 2016, I was really frustrated because I could tell that there was like so many people who were newly mobilizable. There was like so many people who were like pissed and scared who like hadn't been as pissed and scared before. And it's like, you know, welcome to the party. Like things have been terrible forever, but also like fucking welcome to the party. We need everybody. And it was really clear to me that there was an opportunity to build our movements really significantly because so many people were having this fear and frustration, and that what was happening was like these really nightmarish demobilization efforts that people don't know to be demobilization efforts. But what I was seeing was things like, you know, that really tracked to the mythologies we have about how social change happens in the United States, and I think elsewhere to some degree, which is like people being encouraged to really think about their next opportunity to vote, their next opportunity to like give money to a giant nonprofit, you know, click on something online, say something about what you believe in on social media, and like kind of that's it. So like really, really passive ways of engaging that are not about like actually changing conditions right now, but that are mostly about either appealing to elites to change those conditions, like maybe a court will, maybe if I donate to the ACLU, then they'll sue Trump, and then that will somehow make people better. But like in reality, you know, we always lose. Even when we win, we lose because things aren't enforced or whatever. But, you know, you can see so clearly the colonial legal system we live under is not going to like deliver us, you know, freedom from itself. And so I just was frustrated seeing that kind of, especially at the moment, it was like all about raising money for the ACLU and Planned Parenthood, and just like the utter inadequacy of that. Like, of course, I hope those groups exist, but like we need everybody to do so much more than that. Like, those groups cannot meet these crises. And especially because their strategies are actually pretty tame, you know, they're like pretty performance strategies. So there's like, I mean, like we saw with Trump's Muslim ban, like it's like they'll keep suing him about it, and then the administration will just change that Muslim ban until it fits within whatever the law says it has to be, and then it's fine. You know, like that's like we're not gonna resolve this through a lawsuit. So I was frustrated by that, and part of what I felt was just like that ongoing invisibility of mutual aid as a central tactic of social movements. Like there was just like that's not. That's like a race. I think it's a race a lot because it's kind of like feminized labor mostly. Like mutual aid work is like helping people one by one do stuff, taking care of kids, making food. Like it's just like the labor in our movements that's not celebrated, as opposed to like the narrative, which is that it's the moment when some like important man gives a speech that everything changed, or that when some important man like decided, you know, a big case. Like we're told that like social change happens at those moments that are actually usually like things that have come after tons and tons and tons and tons and tons of grassroots organizing, and are usually like very minimal and designed to just kind of like stabilize the ship. And so the real question is like, what is that actual work that keeps people surviving and sows the soil for potential change. And so I was just frustrated that mutual aid was like, again, like so invisible, and that what people know about social movements are these myths, that it's like that speech or that one person who's elected or whatever. So at the time I was just like, how can I like more popularize the idea of mutual aid in my own like, little tiny way, which was that I like made this mutual aid toolkit website that was just like tons and tons of examples of people doing mutual aid in case you wanted to copy that and do it in your own community, and you know, tools for how to structure that, how to make good meetings, you know, just like the basics. And I was giving a lot of talks about mutual aid, and I made like a little 7-minute animated what is mutual aid explainer video with an artist, and wrote an article about mutual aid. So I was just kind of like just doing that out of my own frustration and interest. And then the pandemic started, and I was helping Miriam Cava a bit prepare for her. She was doing a workshop with Andrea Ocasio-Cortez about mutual aid, and then that was kind of like a very public workshop. And then as a result of that, Verso Books asked Miriam if she would write a book about mutual aid for this time period. And Miriam was like, I don't have time to do it, but just have Dean do it. He already has all this stuff. So that was why I read it. And basically, I don't know if people have looked at it or not, but the book has kind of 2 parts. The first part is just like, what is mutual aid and why is it important? And this has changed a little bit actually for me since I wrote the book. Like I keep refining how I define it, but these days I think of mutual aid, as the idea of mutual aid mainstreams, I keep finding out more what's important to say about it that distinguishes it from the way it's being watered down and defanged in mainstream media. So I'd say like the things that are important to me about mutual aid, it's like what it is the part of social movement work where we support each other's survival needs. And it is mutual aid if we, do that based on a shared understanding that it's the systems that have put people in crisis rather than the people in crisis are to blame. Like that's really vital. And 2, that it comes with an invitation to collective action. So it's like, you know, if we're helping you get through some, like you're facing eviction, all the lawyers in town have told you don't have a case, we're this mutual aid group that pickets at landlords' houses and tries to get them to stop evicting you. You come to us, we're going to say, absolutely, we're going to help you. It's completely fucked up that you're facing this. It's not your fault. This is the fault of this terrible housing system we have. And would you like to get involved in our group? We'll help you whether or not you want to get involved in our group, but would you like to get involved in our group and help fight on behalf of everybody who's facing this? You know, that is to me what makes it mutual aid. And I just think that's worth saying because there's like such a watered down version of what mutual aid is that is being promoted these days in a lot of outlets. And part of what this part of the book does that I think is significant and always needs to be said is it distinguishes mutual aid from charity. You know, that's why this is a significant idea, is because we live under a charity mythology that and infrastructure that comes from, you know, European Christian ideas and is about like aggrandizing rich people and having them like give crumbs to poor people, mostly to kind of like legitimize the system that enriches them and allows the extraction. And it's very stigmatizing to people who receive charity or who are considered not eligible, which is most people who are in crisis. You know, you can't be on our wait list for housing because you aren't sober, because you have felony convictions, because you're undocumented, whatever. So, you know, mutual aid is about a belief that that people in crisis are not to blame for the crisis that the systems are, and that we should get to the root causes, as opposed to that we should have, you know, rich people or their charitable foundations decide, you know, which few people get a crumb. The second part of the book is about kind of like how we do this, like what are some of the, you know, main obstacles to doing mutual aid, And a lot of this, people have said to me that it feels like a self-help book as part of the book, which I think is really interesting. Like a lot of it is like, how do we become the people who could live in the society we're trying to build? So if we're right now creating all these mutual aid groups to help people get groceries during COVID, to help people have bail money when they get arrested during the uprising, to help people not get evicted, to take care of each other's kids while we're in court, whatever the thing is. How do we do that work in a way that doesn't, where we don't just reproduce all the same bullshit, where it's like we're like putting white people in charge and not listening to people of color, and we're doing it in a way that's inaccessible to people with disabilities, and we're having someone boss us all around and the rest of us keep our heads down and try not to get in trouble. All the sort of emotional structures we have learned in a society that's based on hierarchy and coercion and brutal violence. How do we not act like that with each other? Because it falls apart when we do. It's really hard to sustain projects when we do, and especially since mutual aid work is mostly done by unpaid people. If I'm going to go in there and you're just going to boss me around because you got here first or because you're older than me or whatever, I'm probably just going to leave. So if we need, there's like so much crisis and we need so many people doing so much mutual aid work. How do we create groups that people would stay in that would feel satisfying, where you would get your own social and emotional needs met, you'd feel seen, you'd feel heard, you'd feel connection, you would build meaningful friendships, people would have your back, you would feel like stimulated, excited, and creative, and if there was conflict, you all would know how to talk about it, and you could make decisions together that actually felt like people would believe in them and implement them, and we would have transparency, and nobody would be stealing the money or bossing everybody around. How do we actually become like that? When none of us ever worked at a place like that, or gone to school at a place like that, or gone to church at a place like that, or been in a family like that. So a lot of this section is about how we build organizational cultures that are like that, how do we learn those skills, how do we prevent conflict, how do we give and receive feedback with each other, just stuff that why do we know how to do it? So I'm excited to talk to you about your questions and then hear what everybody's thinking.
All right, thank you so much.
Chairs are very high concept.
They really are.
I like design.
Because it's round and then also square. It's fabulous.
Really wild high heel shoes.
So the first thing I wanted to ask you is, what's your research process like, and what did you begin with your research and then move into the document, or
I'm laughing because I'm like an academic at my paid job. I don't do any research. It was polemics. I mean, that's not entirely true. That is my joke with myself. I guess my research is that my experience of trying this stuff with people, and for 18 years I was in an organization that was doing free legal support for trans people, a lot of them in prison or in immigration proceedings or foster care, things like that. And so we're trying to operate on mutual aid principles while doing this legal work, and we spent a lot of time, we operated as a collective, and we spent a lot of time experimenting with that method, how can we structure this so that we can get as many people as possible participating? How can we make decisions in ways that are anti-racist? How can we just navigate how hard it is for groups of people to do things together who are raised in societies we were raised in, and who are supporting people in as much crisis as our community. And that, I think a lot of that goes into my ideas about how we could do this stuff that are in the book. And then also I study social movements, just because I'm desperate to find out what has ever worked anywhere. So I just, the way all of us hopefully are, reading books, watching documentaries, listening to interviews, talking to people I can meet, going to events. And so I think a lot of that goes into just always for spending decades just being curious, how has any change ever happened? How did anybody survive during this or that horrible crisis? And I think that my process for this, especially that moment where Trump was elected, and I just felt so strongly about naming mutual aid more clearly was more of a polemical move, but then it's just got in it what I've been looking up. And there's some stuff in the book about the way Hong Kong responded to the pandemic. That was something an article someone just sent me, look, I think this relates to the thesis of all the stuff you've been saying mutual aid, and I'm like, oh great, I'm going to research this. So it's kind of more responsive research. Yeah.
Awesome, thank you. I was wondering, because you kind of mentioned this idea of there's a watered down version of mutual aid starting to be passed around that kind of doesn't respect the work that goes into it. And I'm wondering if you can kind of talk about the core of the idea and then what happens when it becomes watered down.
Yeah. Well, this happens every time there's a crisis. I remember when Hurricane Hugo came through, And you see these stories every time where it's like, look, this guy took out his own boat and rescued people. And this way the story is pitched is simultaneously like, look at kind of like charitable voluntariness, and maybe we don't need FEMA. Like there's this kind of like anti-state kind of vibe in it, like neoliberal anti-state vibe. And it kind of feels like George H.W. Bush led, 1,000 Points of Light, or Reagan's volunteerism, this kind of like right-wing like devolution of the state sort of stuff that we've seen in our lifetimes. And at the same time, it's like, look, mutual aid is just when somebody does something nice. And so I think the pandemic stories that came out about mutual aid, which there have been tons and tons, this is the first time that like language is really mainstream, kind of copy that model, where it wants to ignore that what mutual aid is an indictment of the crises, right? Like when we decide to like do child care for each other and to look for each other, it's because like people don't have what they fucking need. Like things are bad. And most people doing mutual aid know that. That's why they're doing it. They're meeting some gap. They're like, oh look, there's no pandemic relief for undocumented people at all, or people in the sex trades, or anybody who doesn't have an official job. Like all of these, we are meeting something that, and ideally we're doing it in a way that is militantly naming the harm and saying, we're doing this right now here, and we demand housing for all, or we demand, So I think that the way that the mutual aid like journalism of the pandemic period has looked, and we've been kind of copying that defanging. That's what, and whenever people interview me for all these media outlets, I'm like, don't do this thing, please. Still do that framing. They just, that's what their editors want to hear, is like a feel-good story about how people help each other. It's totally complementary with the existing state violence. There's no like, this actually is gonna, this is part of dismantling that way of all of us getting our needs met and building one that like could be sustainable.
Right, it's a crisis response. And that kind of ties to the difference that you've made in mutual aid between like mutual aid itself and then the charity, right? And how charity is kind of like, it's a feel good for the person that's being charitable. I guess my question is, when there is this demobilization of mutual aid happening, and it's in disrespecting kind of like the intensity of it maybe, and there's kind of this idea of like just be charitable, and it's kind of like you do this one action, right? That passive way of engaging. How do we like unlearn the passive ways of engaging when it is meant to be a feel-good thing? Because like humans like to respond to the thing that feels good, so.
Yeah, I mean, people feel terrible right now, and because being passive and living like as a conquered person feels terrible. And then you're sold really cheap like replacements for I think what our natural drives are, which is to share, to collaborate, to connect, to belong. Like we're sold like I want to feel belonging. I'm really scared about what's happening at the border. I want to feel belonging. It's like, click on this. You know what I mean? Post this on. So it's like a very light thing. I want to feel like other people believe what I believe. Media through Facebook. Like just, it's like even all of our emotions are a site of capitalist extraction. So I think the question is, I mean, honestly, I think people need to learn how to feel how bad they feel, so that we could be like, well, what does actually feel better? Like, what is a resilience activity versus what is like a numbing activity, or like or I feel bad. I think I might be implicated. I'm a white person. I live in the U.S. or whatever. I think I might be implicated in this horrible system. I want to feel better. I'm going to send $10 to ACLU. Like that move is not actually ethical, but it comes from a place in us that is appropriately uncomfortable living in a brutal extractive system, and knows that, which is good. That's like a good thing in us, right? And I think the thing about the charity model, one of the things charity, I think the worst thing about charity is that it justifies and sustains the existing system of extraction, right? It says like that it's like Bill Gates is wonderful, he's a genius, and then it's so wonderful that he helps out, like as if it's an extra thing he's doing, as opposed to like he was enriched only through exploiting laborers and the environment like all over the world. That is why he is richer than everybody else, and he shouldn't get to decide like what to do with all the resources. Like, that is just like so messed up. And part of how it does that is it tells us that people who are the wealthiest are most meritorious, and people who are the poorest are like bad people, and that's why they're that way. And so charity replicates that. It's like, oh, I don't know who should I give this money to, because I want to give it to the best person. That nonprofit will decide who really deserves this money. So it all justifies the idea that there is a deserving and undeserving poor, and that somehow we live in a meritocracy, that like these small band-aids can be put on. All of it is driving us away from looking at the root causes of why anybody thinks about housing or transportation or childcare. And so that move of passivity is partly like, I'm not capable of just getting together with my neighbors and being like, it's fucked up that there's nowhere for you to bring your kids during the day, during the pandemic, or I'm worried about the old people who live in the building, or I'm worried about people like hurting each other and these families on my block. Like, let's do something. There's this kind of like, oh, call the cops, give to the nonprofit, vote. Like, it's just this like, and so I think, I don't know what to do about that. I mean, obviously this is what I do about it, but like, I think that what movements do about it, the main way people enter social movements is through mutual aid. It has always been the on-ramp to movement participation. Either I need something, and these other people were giving it out. When I got there, they're like, "Hey, did you know that it's fucked up that you don't have that? And we think that that you're not bad, and you shouldn't be stigmatized for it, and let's get together." Or I'm worried about something, and then I go and I want to help people. Those are the ways people get into movements, and then they get more analysis and more solidarity from being in movements and trying stuff and finding out that they care about people they didn't know they cared about, unlearning stuff they've learned that's shitty about some groups of people, whatever. So I think there's like a question about, I think we've seen, I've worked with tons of people, tons of mutual aid groups during the last 2 years, people who none of them were active before the pandemic. So like that feels exciting to me. Like a lot of people were mobilized, not nearly as many as we would need to like have any speech survival. We need a lot more mobilization. There will be a lot more crises that mobilize people, no doubt. But I think there's some deeper stuff around passivity, like we live in a culture with like the highest quality entertainment that's ever existed on the planet, and it's really addictive, and it's designed perfectly to fuck with us and make us spend as much time on it as possible. And we are more isolated than we've ever been, and so people are actually scared of others and scared of live interactions, scared of joining a group. Like there's a deep set of fears around just social interactions, period, that is the result of living in so much isolation with like so many things mediating our interactions. So I think it's like it's a tall order that like everyone has a role in addressing, in part by just self-evaluating, like what does my isolation feel like, what does my demobilization feel like, what does it feel like to me when I don't want to do anything about what I care about, and then what's the medicine I would need for that, and then how could I create that with others for more people.
Yeah, thank you so much. This is kind of touching on the portion that you had referenced, kind of like the self-help portion, but what the second half of your text is doing, it's addressing like perfectionism, burnout, conflict, and cooperative leadership. And a lot of what you describe and kind of like the layout that you give, it requires like high levels of emotional intelligence, things that we don't seem to get just through going through our daily lives, and all of empathy and self-care. And I was wondering if you could speak a little bit to the dualism of mobilizing movements as we become more in alignment with ourselves and as we find work that honors our values.
Yeah. I mean, my personal belief about this is that most of us were harmed and traumatized in groups. In our family groups, at school, at church, at work. Like that's where like the terrible stuff happened, where like bad things happened to us, people didn't believe us, we weren't listened to, we were excluded. Like the worst ways we feel about ourselves happen in groups, and I think the healing happens in groups. So it's like, I think people should do mutual aid because like people that are in place live right now here in Olympia, and the cops fighting somebody right now, whatever. But also, like, you get a lot out of it. Like, I think people form really deep relationships with people who are not like them doing mutual aid work, and then you have people who actually have your back. Like, the level of isolation we all live under is so dangerous for us. Like, when you have nobody to bring you soup when you're sick, when you have nobody who you can talk to when you're in a domestic violence relationship. Like, isolation is, like, super deadly. And so, figuring out how to do things that bring us out of isolation is in our own best interest. And I think that kind of emotional intelligence that I'm describing in the book, it's like everyone I talked to who reads the book is like, oh yeah, like on some level they already knew this. Like, I knew that my workplaces felt like bad and that this is why, you know what I mean? And this makes sense that this would help. And so I think it's like just like remembering ourselves, kind of like I think people can adapt very quickly and learn, like relearn or unearth those skills in ourselves. Like I have a lot of faith in that. Not that it's easy. I mean, also like social movement groups always historically and now are, always having tons of conflict and really hard things happen and they split up and they, stop working and whatever. And that's just feels like the complexity of being humans and living under these systems and having imbibed a lot of bad ideas and acting them out on each other. But yeah, I do believe that like we have the capacity to like change that pretty significantly through practice.
Awesome, thank you so much. The isolation is deadly, and which is a brilliant statement. But I was wondering if you could speak a little bit to what like the new relationships tool of here's how we can communicate with each other, here's how we can access to each other, that it actually ends up becoming like a very isolationist tool. You can go with the internet and not have any reciprocal interaction or control. So how do we engage with this tool that is built for communication and also helps us kind of follow in that isolation?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's always helpful to remember that any technology either was invented
It's like car showing up in there, but
like, so it's like, there may be other things we do with it, you know what I mean? Like, we make pretty rainbow lights, that's not my thing.
Okay.
You know what I mean? Yeah, all technology is invented, they're done for, multi-source extraction use. And the internet technology that we use, especially like social media platforms, they're for-profit extraction and surveillance platforms. And people do sometimes break our isolation. We sometimes, are being trans, like, the first trans people I ever met were like listservs in the 90s, like that was amazing. And a lot of people, so it's not to say that, it's not to be like absolutist about technology, but just to remember like that we're probably being played. And then to try to be smart about how to deal with it. And this, you see active students all the time trying to figure out like how can we use the internet without having the government read all of our stuff, or people are always trying to figure this out. How can we use these technologies without having to exclude people without sight, people who have less access to high quality internet, whatever, all the kind of access issues. But I feel like I think that most people have not gotten enough time to really think about the impact of like social media and internet use on our isolation. It really masquerades as something that will make us feel belonging and like loved and connected. And I really think it mostly does the reverse. And I like that there is like a world of people who are trying to think about like how can we use these things in moderation, or how can we not believe what it is telling us about itself, like I think there was a really interesting, you said there was a really interesting piece where like a lot of people were talking about Twitter feminism, and then these activists from San Francisco, public housing activists, like wrote this piece like, Twitter is a corporation that is displacing people from low income housing in San Francisco. Like Twitter feminism, the Twitter is killing women, like, you know what I mean, just this kind of like, this has a material reality, this is not just like a space, like a gorgeous utopian space, So I feel like that kind of intervention is really useful, and then people are doing like, I think a lot of people are doing kind of detailed like social media hygiene work together, like how can you and I have accountability that we won't check our phones before we eat, before we stretch, or just people trying to like actually break some of the addictive levels. I do think it like is designed to be addictive and to replace. Basically, capitalism wants to find a way to mediate, like to prevent us from, to have profit extraction happen anywhere we are, and this is just like the latest thing. It's like, how can they extract profit from my need for connection? And that is working.
Yeah, thank you so much. And also, welcome, hi. Something you spoke about a little bit earlier, social movement, we work in a way that we could support each other's survival needs. And I thought that was a really interesting choice of words because at least in this area, at least in America, there's this idea of like, oh, like we should have all our survival needs met because capitalism ought to be working, and so we have our survival needs met, supposedly, but we clearly don't. So how, can you speak a little bit to how we identify these survival needs that are not being met, and what do we do when we encounter the force that says no, all your needs are being met, but we still feel that lack, or we can't access it for whatever reason. Like if we can't access a home, we can't access a home.
Yeah, I think the story is like, if you do everything right, all your survival needs will be met. Right, and we know that like, the United States is a colonial racial project based on death. Like it is a death machine. Like it is designed to like try to eliminate whole groups of people, or work certain people to death, or abandon certain people to death. And that is, it's working perfectly, both by like keeping millions of people in cages and making millions of people be so impoverished that they don't have the basic necessities. So I think it's like it's like survival needs are the ethical place to start any social movement work, and they're the reason social movements exist is because people are like in crisis and then organize and fuck shit up because they can't live anymore. And other people who are maybe not in that exact situation join them because they are called to do what's right. And yeah, we'll keep living under this mythology of meritocracy, or the mythology that if you work hard, you'll do well here. I mean, just these are absurd. Hopefully they are ideas that are patently, obviously absurd. But their heart can also be internalized now. Like people feel shame for being poor, feel shame for being unemployed, feel shame, you know, that is like real. I'm thinking right now about this, you know, probably the most famous, like, mutual aid project on the left in the United States is the Black Panther Party's, like, you know, free breakfast program in the 70s, right? And I saw this movie about that where this woman is talking about how her family went and got breakfast there, and they the kids ate breakfast, and how, like, how profound it was, because she felt like they were bad for being poor. Like, and so did her parents. She felt like it's like shameful that you feed your kids breakfast. And then they went to this place and there was free breakfast and people were like, it's fucked up that black people can't eat breakfast, and like this is white supremacy, and just like what that moment was like for her as a child, she was like 8 or something, what it was like to be like, right, we're not bad, this system is bad. And that to me is the fundamental like thing mutual aid does, is says like we all are entitled to like dignity and survival and belonging and connection and safety, and that is if we don't have it, it's not because we're bad, it's because the system's bad, you know.
Thank you. I was wondering if you could speak a little bit about the idea of like shifting like workplace culture. In the text, you kind of have this column of working compulsively versus working joyfully, and a lot of the language around workplace cultures kind of seems to celebrate like beating yourself down, become a machine, get the work done, and risk yourself to complete it. And it's kind of a two-part question. What do you think happens when we begin to change the language around workplace culture and allow humans to be in pursuit of joyful work? And what is the important difference between the sincerity of creating joyful work versus kind of like Kool-Aid culture of like manufactured positivity and cruel optimism?
Yes. I wish we had a different word for work, because work is the word we all associate with our jobs where we experience extreme exploitation and extraction. And the way we feel there is appropriately like, fuck this, I wish I could go home early, I wish I could steal something here. Like that is, right, that is like absolutely dead on ethical. And then when we go to do mutual aid work together, we call it work, and then it's like, I'm like not calling you back because I'm just like, I don't want to do another spreadsheet. When actually, ideally, I'd be like, wow, you and I are in a project together because we care about unhoused people in Olympia. Like, I feel connected to like my purpose as a human being on earth, to like be with others, to stop suffering and injustice. And I can feel that energy about that spreadsheet. But instead, because it's been a lifetime being like, I don't want to do my homework, I don't want to have to go to this job, I feel this other thing. You know what I mean? Like, this is a dilemma. People feel work avoidant, which is, and then it seeps into any kind of work. You know, we feel about our housework, whatever. And ideally, we could cultivate the capacity to be like, how do I connect to purpose? And pleasure about doing things that matter to me in the way that it can be pleasurable, like, you know, change your best friend's baby's diaper because you're like, I love that this baby came and I'm so happy to support my friend and I want to take a nap, you know, and it's like changing a diaper could be like horribly annoying, messy work, or it could be like this pleasure, or like taking care of a loved one who's dying, you know, versus taking care of a bunch of dying people because you're a work nurse in a, you know, in a hospital, you know what I mean? So like, I think there's just like something about that chart is, you know, it's a tool from the 12-step program, Workaholics Anonymous, but it's just this question, and I think you're right, there is like this pressure for everybody in the United States to be like chipper and upbeat all the time at their terrible fucking job, and they're told like it's a family here and stuff, like, you know, yeah. But yeah, like I'm curious about how we shift that, because I think that's part of what you're talking before about demobilization and passivity, like people being like, oh, I don't want to go to a meeting, I don't want to like go on a Zoom about, you know, the people trying to stop the sweeps in my town, or people trying to, you know, do the old change, whatever. I don't have another thing to do. I'm too tired for this. And it's like, no, this could feed you. Like, you know, some version of connecting with others about what you care about, whatever version works for you, you know, could actually make you have more support and care in your life, could actually mean that more people had your back, knew who you were, shared your values, but instead it just gets lumped in with every other way we've ever worked. And I struggle with that myself. I've like seen myself need to create practices for feeling on purpose when I've got just like a bunch of grunt work to do in a mutual aid project, which is all time. You know, it's made a difference. It took a lot of repetition and a lot of like, I need to build a ritual around this. This is the part of I'm gonna light a candle, I'm gonna work on, you know, just whatever it was that would help me remember why I'm doing this, and then I have a different experience of it. Like, it doesn't feel like a drain in the same way. Like, I think we can ask ourselves, like, when does a task feel like a resilience task? When does it feel like a drain? You know, and it also relates to other things, like, am I holding my body in positions that I learned, feeling avoidant and miserable in a really brutal job or could I do this in a more refined way? Could I, I don't know, just like these, I don't know, could I make this different for myself? Is there any option here? Or could I ask for help in a way I never would have in that space? Or, is there just, or could we as a group do this in a different way than we're taught to do? A lot of people start mutual aid groups and they start to look like a lot like a nonprofit office, and it's like, why? Nobody's getting paid. Like, let's make this different than that,
Yeah. Thank you so much. I have a few more questions. I forgot my phone. Where are we at on time?
It's 5:35.
Thank you so much. What you just said, like when you are experiencing like burnout, you're tired, you don't want to go out and do something that it could feed you, right? It reminds me of something that you said a bit earlier about like kind of where we're at with just the fear of human interaction. Like we're kind of like scared of everything. Sometimes it feels like we have really good reasons, and sometimes we do have really good reasons. And I was wondering if you could speak a little bit about like the design and function of having like being fearful, like who benefits when we're scared to interact with each other, and who benefits when we refuse to feed each other, like when that mutual aid would be the thing that feeds each other.
Yeah, I mean, I think about this a lot with abolition. It's just like, they want us to have no option but to call the cops. You know what I mean? They want me to walk by you getting harassed by somebody on the street and be like, oh, I can't do anything except for calling 911. When I could just be like, fuck off, or whatever, like, hey, will you help me? Like, there's a million other options, but like that disempowerment is being conquered. That is our conquering. You know what I mean? It's the sense that they want us to not be able to figure out any way to have food, energy, transportation, childcare, except for through capitalist exploitation. I have to work this wage job to pay this rent. There can't be any other option. It can't be like, oh, we're gonna squat, oh, we're gonna camp. Anything else is prohibited by law. And so I think that is a lot of it. It's just like and that's why mutual aid is consistently criminalized, is because it is incredibly threatening. If we figure out ways to meet each other's and our own needs in our communities, and especially the history of like the criminalization of Black mutual aid in the United States, like just a consistent and Native mutual aid. You've seen those stories of whose housing experiments get bombed, and who the cops raid and take all the food, just again and again. And yeah, I think that there's a real threat in this thing that we're told isn't, that's a race for social movements altogether. Like, oh, people give each other food. It's so cute. It's kind of the current story about pandemic mutual aid. It's like, oh, it's like so ferocious, when done with a political purpose and collaboration.
Thank you. Something else that you said earlier, the idea that like whatever it is, the problem is not to be solved through the lawsuit, right? And I'm thinking about how when we are watching the news and we see like some sort of lawsuit is coming up, and we think like that's the thing that's going to fix it, and it's kind of a mixed dual thought with the idea of entering the system so you can try and fix the system. And I'm wondering if you can speak a little bit to, is there a way to engage with mutual aid on a very human and connected level, and is it worth it to kind of enter the system to try and fix it, or the kind of a vague question.
No, I get it. I mean, these are the questions people have where they're like, should I become a nurse? Should I become a lawyer? Should I become a teacher? Because could I change the system? And I think that what everybody I know who's tried all those things finds is that no, we cannot single-handedly change giant systems, as a worker in them. But sometimes you can get in there and like steal shit for people, like get some care they weren't supposed to get. Like you can go into those spaces and do harm reduction. Sometimes you can do some organizing, like I think all teachers are organizing or the nurses are organizing. That's amazing. But what I teach in the law school, and what I encourage my students to do is like, yes, if you're gonna maybe you're gonna be a poverty lawyer, you're gonna do the same eviction case over and over again, you're gonna do the same benefits case over and over again. What you're doing is definitely not getting to the root cause of the problem. It's not changing everything, but like if this is what you want to do for your paid job, like great, it's beautiful work to try to support poor people through horrible fucked up systems. And you need to be doing social movement work that's unpaid. Because if you're not also part of the housing justice movement, if you're not also part of the movement in your town to actually get to the root causes of poverty, then all you are is like you're just like the front face of the court system. You're like, I'm your lawyer, I'm the front face of the court system. What was the first thing you said in that question?
Oh, sorry, it's a very messy system here. The idea that like it's not going to be solved through
a lawsuit. Oh yeah. I just, people are really freaking out about the anti-trans laws all over the country, and asking me about that a lot, because I did like trans law for a long time. And I feel like my answer is like not something anyone wants to hear, but it's like those laws can result in harm to people. That harm is already happening. And when you live in states like Washington where there's like good laws on the books for trans people, you still have all that fucked up shit happening. Like you have trans women be like could get out of a prison sentence, except for that none of the drug treatment places will take it. I mean, like, and this is just an example of something that, like, I called the Attorney General's office saying, like, you guys have a law against discrimination against trans people in the state. This is happening at a space that you pay for. Would you make it stop? And they're like, no, we can't do anything. I mean, that, you know, like, they're not enforced. Anti-discrimination laws, all kinds are not enforced. So, like, good laws or bad laws, like, they're trans people and other people, like, you know, aging out of the foster care system in your town today into homelessness and criminalization. Are we working on a mutual aid project to get them all a place to stay? Like, to me, it just feels like, again, like, if we just care about the laws, then we're like, I hope the ACLU will save us from the bad trans laws. What do? Throw up my hands, put something on social media, and send a donation to the ACLU. But the actual harms that we're, like, I'm so glad that people care about trans youth, but I wish they would do something to support trans youth right now, instead of watching this celebrity sideshow of what's gonna happen in these states with these legislators. Like, it's just, that's like a whole elite band. Like, people will be trans no matter what laws they pass, and we'll, like, do amazing weird shit and freak them out forever, as we always have, and we will be hurt no matter what good laws, like, good legislators pass. Like, the work to actually get to the conditions on the ground is never at the level of law and policy, and there's such an obsession with law and policy, like, that's how you really, like, cement. But it's like, I mean, I think about, obviously, for me, the big example of this, I mean, the Americans with Disabilities Act, like, how long has that existed in the United States? You know, since George Bush. And it's like, it was like, it's been eviscerated by the courts, and then there was legislative fixes, and then those were eviscerated by the courts, like that. Like, there's no actual, like, you know, the level of power of people with disabilities in the United States is, like, systemic, it's structured, it's on purpose, you know. Or I think about the, you know, our whole regime around labor in the United States, and, like, the creation of the National Labor Relations Board in the wake of the Depression, and just the, like, these things are created to sustain extractive systems, not to get rid of them. Like, if we want to get, like, you know what I mean? So the suffering is being constantly produced, and we need to, like, meet that where it's at and not hope that any law will change that, and then also, like, be building giant movements where people are doing incredibly bold action to dismantle those systems. And as I said, most people enter social movements through mutual aid work. And then hopefully they do stuff like bomb pipelines and break people out of prison and you know, take over the Capitol, all the things that we need, like all the bolder solutions that allow us to, you know, and to beat back the kind of constant encroachment of criminalization and militarization of our lives, and to build like the world we want to live in. And I just feel like, it's the same way that like elections are just like a celebrity sideshow. It's just like all this stuff that we're supposed to watch and be like, yeah. It's like, it's gonna be the same, kind of. And the thing that we're mad about, we could work on right now. And like, there's nothing I can do about like whether Medicare for all is gonna pass, like pretty much. It's like, it's a very little I can do, or very little I can do to make the Green New Deal, which is totally inadequate, pass. But I could like be causing so much trouble in my own town or neighborhood to try to produce a moment in which we have a different grid, or in which we have different transportation. I mean, like there's so much that's much more local that like we could all be involved, and that's the kind of passivity thing. Like the elite solutions will happen. My job is to like vote and watch and, you know, comment.
Yeah, thank you so much. I want to let the audience ask questions if you guys have questions, so I'm going to ask only a few more and then I will pass the floor to you all. But,
Can I interrupt for a second? Sorry. Would it be okay if we turned off these like, I wonder if there's enough light from this?
Let's try it.
Yeah.
I don't know how to turn those off though, do they?
no, we can grab Mike.
Yeah. Okay, I can go grab them. Okay.
Awesome, thank you. I was thinking about agency and empowerment, and we do kind of enter into that like passive activism, like I share a black square on my Instagram or something like that, versus like what do you actually do. And I think there's like a half idea of like, this is enough, like the donating, the charity, it's enough. And then there's a half idea that I actually can't do anything, I have no agency, I have no power. And I was wondering if you could speak a little bit to how do we kind of shift the culture around self-agency and empowerment, in which like you are enough, and you are enough that you have an effect if you were to, you know, go out and seek that work.
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's something really concerning going on. I do think that social media is designed to make us believe we have participated in something when we have not. Like there's a feeling that I have materially done something when I have not. So I don't think it's meaningless. Social media is not meaningless by any means. Like, obviously, it's like we should do culture, co-creation culture anywhere, everywhere. And I do think it does that, and people spread ideas. Like I don't know about you guys, but like I remember when the battle was Seattle happened in 1999, and I was living in LA, and I didn't find out about it until it was like on the news. Whereas now, if I I can know about in detail about like fine-grained things happening in social movement circles all over the country. You know, there's amazing ways we're trading information that we didn't used to get to. Love it. And you know, that we had zines and we had, you know, other things, but it can be really incredible. And I really think that for a lot of people, they think they're so involved in some drama that's happening on social media about something political that is actually where all of their political energy is going, and they think that something has occurred, when really all that's happened is a bunch of content has been written for a corporation by unpaid workers, all this, you know, and so it's like, that is worrying me, and so I don't know what's gonna happen with that. Like, people feel so urgent and freaked out about nuclear war and climate change and all these things, but mostly think that all they can do is like make sure they say the right stuff on social media. And I mean, we've never had this is new technology, we've never had this exact problem before in the history of, you know, the world. I think that organizers all over are trying to invite people to campaigns that get them involved in something in a different way. Like, I mean, I've been really moved by the Cops Off Campus campaign in the last few years, or, you know, there have been so many kind of really brilliant ways of trying to plug people into like, very like to doing something that makes a difference, like a material difference locally, or all the campaigns to stop new jails and prisons from being built or stop expansion of detention centers, like all of that kind of work I really believe in as the way to like pull people towards a sense they could be part of something with others and participate in lots of different ways. Or like, you know, there's been a lot of people's disasters relief, like I was just hearing about how during Hurricane Ida, people were doing this really brilliant kind of disaster relief where you could be wherever you live and be on the phone helping connect people and resources for all of this stuff that was being driven in by people to the Gulf South. You know, there's like, people are using technology in interesting ways to try to make there be tons of ways for us all to plug into being more mobilized. But most people are totally demobilized and are just, and a lot of people who feel really woke and involved are only just branding themselves on social media, that's their only activity. And I like love that they care about things, and I don't like when I judge that, but I am worried about like, how do we help move that towards action that is more threatening to the status quo and meets more people's basic needs, because that does not do that.
Thank you so much. Real quick check in. Would fluorescence add or deteriorate from this situation? Are we okay with the lighting, or raise your hand if you would like a big giant fluorescent light? Okay, great.
I like this intimacy.
Yeah.
It's like candlelit.
Last question before I pass this off to the floor. I was wondering if you could speak more to how we can create social networks to show up for each other as we're mobilizing systems of mutual aid, simultaneously while we're experiencing the opposition from preset systems that encourage secrecy, perfectionism, and burning out.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's really a different journey in some ways for each person. Like, I am a very social person, and so I want to just recognize it's like very easy for me. It's like meet new people and be really interested in them and talk to them and find out what they are into, you know, and that's just not true for everybody. Like, people really have very different ways that it feels good to connect or to give and receive care. And so I think one of the things is just like, how can we all have as much self-awareness as possible about what might help us connect with others? You know, I think, like figuring out like what kinds of connections work for me, what kinds of care do I want to receive, what kinds of care do I want to give people, like those are very basic questions, but I think that can help. Or also like knowing what you're scared of or what freaks you out, then when you go to a meeting and you're feeling all those freaked out feelings or you're scared, you might be like, oh, it's okay, right now I'm scared in this way because this is how it happened to my family, or this is what it was like when I went to school, but maybe there's like a chance that it's different than that here, or I can try to look for some allyship. Maybe is there any allyship for me in the room that I'd be missing because I'm so used to looking for what I'm scared of, you know, whatever. Just like people, there's a lot of like work we all have to do to just like undo some of that built-in fear of interaction that is, you know, really going around right now. But I don't know, and I think there's just also like some of the research I've read about like the advent of smartphones is about how people no longer experience solitude. So like it used to be that like you might be like on, you know, the computer sometimes, but you're also sometimes just like on the bus or waiting at the bus stop or walking, and like solitude in this book was defined as when you're not receiving on people's ideas. So if I'm always listening to a podcast, I'm always listening to a song, I'm always reading email, I'm always looking at Instagram, and one of the results, according to this research, which like pop psych stuff, was like people have a hard time processing big feelings. And then it just aren't. So you're just stuffing your big feelings. You're like, well, I just had a really weird interaction with my friend at lunch, but now I'm listening to this podcast, and now I'm looking at Instagram, and now I'm online shopping, and you know, and then it's like, So I think that that's actually like really catching up with us. And then also there's all this research about how people have very shallow social interactions. Like they studied like, you know, teenagers in the 2010s, and they were just like looking at like, you know, what did they talk about with their friends over lunch and dinner and stuff, and people living in dorms and colleges, whatever. And they were just finding that because people were constantly interrupted in the middle of their interactions, they were unlikely to like dive into a big topic like, you know, what happened with my parents, or, you know, something that was hard. And I don't know, so it's like I'm worried about that. Like I said, like there's like the self-awareness piece. It's like, you know, there's a horrible self-care industry that's just like has a very limited, thin story about like building self-awareness. That's just about like becoming basically a better worker and prettier and skinnier or something. What we need is the like, oh, if I want to ethically participate in like tearing down everything you live under and building something that any of us could survive, then it's worth it for me to build some emotional awareness, and to think about how my interactions with other people feel and what I'd like them to be like, and is there any way towards that, and grieve what's hard about it, like feel big feelings, you know? And I don't feel like there's a lot of that growing right now because of that, you know, that very addicting entertainment technology, but open for it. This has been really helpful.
Thank you so much. Does anyone have any questions?
It's not, I don't know if it's like I mean, there's so many strands of what you're, it's like, it's so rich, but something that really struck me was when you said that a lot of harm that we've experienced has happened in groups. And I think that's really profound, and I haven't really thought about that in the context of mutual aid and working with groups of people, and like that adding to maybe a lot of like unconscious resistance and unconscious fear of it, because I think we're just like really terrified that the same things are going to happen again. And I feel like that ties into what you just said as well around being able to feel big feelings, and that we don't have, because we haven't practiced resiliency to them and to experiencing with other people, we just really struggle with conflict and with things going awry. Every time that happens, it feels like a crisis. So we don't have the resiliency to be like, this is so normal, and like we're in it together, and it doesn't make us bad that like we're having a hard time. And so I don't know, I guess like you've spoken to that a lot, and I guess it's kind of, there's so much personal work needed to be able to help and be helped. Like we're just like, we've practiced the opposite for so long. And I don't know, I guess it's not a question, but I just, I'm reflecting, and yeah, thank you.
I appreciate you saying that. I think that like, the thing is too, we're afraid that if we go and be in groups, the things that happened before will happen again. The thing is, they will. Like, right, because I'm living is this experience. So when you like don't say hi to me when I walk into the place, I'm like, oh my god, it's just like my sister. we go there, we just all go all the way fucking there every fucking time, you know. And that is we are walking around with all the wounds from whatever happened, and then we do, and if we're a little scared when we go into the group, we're kind of looking to feel them again. I'm kind of like, is anyone in here doing this? Is anyone in here asking too much of me? Whatever our trip is, you know, all of which happens. Or I'm walking in here like I'm a barrel and I'm gonna be the savior of everybody, and I've got all this colonial white baggage on, whatever. There's a million versions, but we are running scripts, like cultural scripts, family scripts, you know, whatever. And we are going to have, as you said, if you do something you care about with someone else, there will be conflict. And then what we mostly do is, that must mean I'm bad or you're bad. You know, I think there's just like, I mean, I don't know, it's like really hard to think about how to build less conflict averse group culture. I think it's, you know, people are doing it in lots of ways. There's a lot of really amazing like new kind of like workbooks coming from the transformative justice movement about conflict. Like you know, there's just like good tools are being made about conflict, how to have hard conversations, how to have reparative conversations, how to figure out your conflict style, like all of this stuff. Which what I think is useful to do with it is not like it's the Bible and we all answer something, but just like in the group, read it together. Like it just gives you a way to talk like, oh, like I think I'm doing the victim style right now, or I think you're doing the savior style right now. And it just gives you a basis for being like, this is a legit conversation worth having, as opposed to just running the scripts and not talking about, oh my god, I didn't sleep last night because of our conversation, like, or whatever would be the more real way to engage. So I'm happy that that stuff is coming out because I think this is the work. And what I'm noticing at mutual aid groups is most groups, we get together and we're like, we want to organize to stop the sweeps, and they're happening in Seattle. Like we want, and we get really focused on that external goal, and we never talk about our group and how we're making decisions and who's missing and why did that person leave and why does Dean boss everybody around. Like we don't do that. And then 6 months later, no one's in the group, or I'm in the group with 2 other people, and we all are heavily identifying as victims and burnout. And so I'm just like, I think that there's like a how do you, and that's a feminist. I feel like that's fundamentally a feminist practice. How do you care about what's in here and not just what's out there?
Absolutely.
Thank you. Any other questions?
I was really interested in what you said about mutual aid being a gateway. I've taught a couple of classes at Evergreen on catastrophe, community resilience in the face of disaster, and I've been involved in political stuff a long time, mainly treaty rights support, trying to get rural white people to support Native sovereignty. And what I just found so powerful about mutual aid was I always had the assumption in both my activism and as an educator that you kind of raise people's consciousness and that you get them to a point of radical consciousness, people with really strong analysis, and then they do action because of that. And it just completely flips it around, where you can have, out in Aberdeen, people with pretty damn conservative politics or neoliberal politics where you don't necessarily want to have a conversation with them, but they get involved in stuff and they do radical things. And given the choice between someone who has radical consciousness and doesn't do radical action, and someone who does radical action but may not have radical consciousness, I tend now to go for the latter. And so working with some of the rural white folks who perhaps aren't there on some things, they might even be, because of the vacuum in our media and educational system, they might have been taken in by like even a right-wing populist kind of message. But they will work with their native neighbors when it comes to disaster resilience in particular. And because the tribes are doing it so much better, they have an intact sense of community, they have a sense of organization, they have sovereignty, so they can, at least limited sovereignty, where they can do things independently, what the state is doing, and do it better. And the settler neighbors of the tribes are noticing this. And I saw this also in New Zealand. I went to New Zealand to study precisely this. And settlers beginning to accept indigenous authority because it's healthier for them and protects their own communities better than their own governments do. And so I'm just wondering if you've seen, I've also seen instances like the Greenberg tornado in Kansas, where in the tornado recovery, they did all sorts of reforms in renewable energy and nonpartisan elections, and some of them started out pretty conservative and ended up through their actions, not through someone like me or an activist or an educator talking to them, but through their actions at a pretty radical place. So I'm wondering if you've seen other examples of kind of people through mutual aid being brought to kind of a higher level of understanding, not necessarily in the ways that we think of it, either through activism or education.
Yeah, totally. I think that political education is like a natural result of mutual aid. I mean, the way that I first began to understand this was I was working in this group that I mentioned that does like trans, legal services for trans people who are low income. And trans people show up to organize with us and to do stuff, and someone comes in and they're like, I'm so mad at what's been happening in the shelter system. I'm here to I want to fight that. And I also want this help with this thing that's happening in shelters, or I'm here because of what happened to me with the cops, or what's happening in the foster system, or whatever. Those people would not necessarily be in solidarity with other people in the group. But I hate immigrants, or they have all the same, they've been misdirected about who their enemy is, as we all have in this society, to not have solidarities that would benefit them actually, right? And then watching people watching all of us just be like, oh, I didn't know that, or I didn't know I cared about these people. Oh, now, and now we're having an event at the project that's all about Palestine. And now people are like, I am a trans person who's Puerto Rican, lives in New York City, and now I care about Palestinians. I didn't know, you know what I mean? And what led me here was my transaction, that mode or that shift. And I think that part of it is just what you said, just understanding that people have been given terrible incentives to blame the wrong people for our problems, and like I think white working class people in the United States, like for real, have been given like the really wrong story about who's our enemy and who's our friend, and that and I feel like I've learned more about that since moving to this very white part of the country, like about the very smart work people are doing. I've seen this like around like, you know, trailer home organizing in certain rural parts of Washington, or you know, other like poverty-based organizing that's really about trying to counter-recruit from the far right works, which is like the stakes, unfortunately, here, feels really significant. And I think it's I do think you can have mutual aid projects, though, that also that are mutual aid in the sense that they're doing some kind of survival work, but then they can end up replicating some of the exclusive ideologies. So like I've seen this with the people starting a project to help people in their community, but then they're like no drug users, or like no big felonies, or you know, they're like, because even in our own communities we have like shame and we believe the bullshit about people in our own communities, you know, sometimes. And so like that is a danger, is like how do we make sure that stuff doesn't work its way in, and how do we make sure the most radical and transformative like political threads undergird our mutual aid. And so I think that sometimes that's why it's useful that people are like share information across like regions about mutual aid projects, so we can make sure like how could our prison pen pal program be abolitionist? Like most people who are joining it aren't abolitionists yet. That's fine, but like how could we, what would be the principles of how we would enact it that would make it abolitionist, or how would we, you know, like how could we do this? I just read really interesting about the history of the sanctuary movement in the United States, and like a lot of the sanctuary movement in the 80s really was not border abolitionist. They excluded people from getting sanctuary support if they, you know, weren't the perfect immigrant or whatever. You know, like this is very common. So how do we, knowing that that is a danger, try to build out these kinds of projects in a way that maximizes people growing new solidarities and getting real about who the systems are that are our actual enemies. And I think like that's not a given. Like yeah, so that's one thing that I think about a lot with all these new mutual aid programs starting during COVID. Like I've talked to a lot of people, like people doing like work, you know, supporting folks in a homeless encampment in LA, like that were just like, we aren't sure if we should put our politics too much in the front, you know, maybe we shouldn't, maybe it would make some people uncomfortable. And like some of the people in the homeless encampment, yes, no doubt, like also hate homeless people and believe the city's bullshit on homeless people. Yes, like poor people can be anti-poor, people can be racist against people in their own group. I mean, all these rhetorics that, you know, we're all very like, we don't make any sense, you know? And yes, like put your politics on the front. Say housing for all at your charging station. Why not? Like people will still come charge their phones, and then you'll have an interesting conversation like about why they think some people don't deserve housing. Great, tell me more. I'll tell you why I think they should. Like that's what we're trying to do here. Actually, is like influence each other, exchange ideas, not like force you to believe anything to charge your phone, but just like charge your phone and here's our sign or whatever. You know, so I think that like that is, I think, a dilemma. Like I think that I see some groups facing is like, do they want to hide their politics and their solidarity because they're divisive or something? And I'm like, you're not a charity that's just solely trying to serve the most people. We are never going to serve everybody like with like our mutual aid projects in an extractive system. Like I talk to people a lot. I'm sorry, going on, but I talk to people a lot who are doing these projects that are just like Venmo projects, where it's like, you know, people from some group can get, you donate to us and then we give it out, you know. There's tons of projects, people for medical expenses, for artists, for rent, whatever. And I'm like, we can never raise enough money to meet the crowd. Like, no, they have all the money. That's the whole thing. Like, they have the money, they have the guns. All we have is the people of power. If we aren't also trying to figure out how that is a mutual aid project that mobilize people to action besides sending money on Venmo when they feel bad, then it's not, I mean, it's better than nothing. Yes, let's give each other money as much as we can, but it's not like gonna get us there. There's a lot of people, these groups I've been working with that have been doing these Venmo projects for like 2.5 years now are like, fuck, like people's needs are so high. Like one person's needs $20,000 for something really important, they absolutely need it. And like what do we do? You know what I mean? And I'm just like, yeah, this just isn't actually the answer. Like we can still try to do it, we should do it. But like if we're not building another strategy as part of it, if it's not helping people who give, do something that's a deeper engagement that's gonna get to the root causes, if it's not causing us to all make more trouble for the systems, then we're just like I'm handing you $50 to pay your ridiculous dental bill and you're handing me the $50 back. You know, we're now closer to having free dentistry or whatever. You know, so I think that's the one of the questions too about like I feel like I love what you're saying about, and I've seen this too with like some of the disaster relief stuff I've heard about the Gulf South after Hurricane Ida, like especially in like Vietnamese refugee community, fisher people there, like people doing mutual aid, getting each other's boats out of the, you know, where they're stuck, or helping each other with these basic things in ways that are like building people's both like preparedness for the next storm and like political mobilization around why like it's totally fucked up that FEMA doesn't have any forms of Vietnamese and like all the millions of ways in which disaster response is totally inadequate and designed to be. Yeah, thank you for your work. It's really fun to hear about.
Yeah, one of the things about these unlikely alliances is they're not just temporary alliances of convenience, but people learn from each other,
Yeah.
and that strengthens the community. Whether they win or lose, like against a pipeline or something, they still have that. I thought it was interesting you said the thing about, I wish we had another word for work, because I noticed in New Zealand, when people use the word for work in the sense of laboring together, they use the Maori word for it, which is mahi. Both Maori and white people, Pākehā, would use the term mahi. So they kind of, because they understand the word work doesn't convey.
Yeah, we really need
Yeah, that was really interesting.
That's cool. I heard an example of people actually doing that. Thank you.
Are there any other questions?
I just have a comment about I think a lot, I've thought a lot similarly to you about like people numbing and not having the depth of their feelings, but I also, it's not a fully formed thought, but I just feel like there's something else there too, and that we, as a human species, and especially in capitalism, we've been through so much trauma that like you can't really get, like conflict is so connected to trauma. Even a small minor conflict is so connected to trauma. So there's this way that to have some cushioning around it like helps people process it too. So I wondered about, like, because I also have heard, you know, from my friends who work at colleges of like this generation, millennial generation, needing to be in groups more to like communicate rather than one-on-one. And so I'm curious just evolutionarily about our psychology and spirit with this of because there's something around the social media that connects us in like really positive, broad ways too. And I do think that we're moving to, I study a little bit about astrology, and we're into this time of the age of Aquarius, whereas we've been in this time of Pisces, which is more defined by leaders, singular leaders and dictators and royalty and famous people and that kind of stuff, and devotion to someone or to something. And that the age of Aquarius that we're moving into is so much more about collective and connectivity to each other. And whereas we've been in this pyramid scheme, we're more moving into this like rippling waters kind of place. And so I feel there's something really valuable, and there's something we can't quite understand yet about this way. It's almost, it may be like, there may be some really positive ways of dissipating trauma or like helping to process, because we've just been through so much as humans that it's just, and we can't process it all. Like we just, our spirits and psyche like can't. So that distraction, it's distraction, but it's also connection. It's like learning about different people. It's expanding people's consciousness also. So that's just, yeah, some of my thoughts.
Is it okay if I expand on that? Because I was thinking about that too, and it's not like I want to be like, no, technology's good or whatever. Like I totally hear all the things that you're saying, and there's some skills I think also that like young people are developing through this like online connection around like creating norms of like how we treat each other, how we respond to each other. People know what gaslighting means. People know, like, don't delete all your comments after you said a bunch of rude stuff, because that's gonna make it so you can't be held accountable for that. Like, and it can be intimidating if you're not used to those kinds of rules or standards, but it's, I don't know, I just find it really interesting that there's like new ways of holding each other accountable, even in those contexts when it might be about something little. I think it impacts our culture, and I'm actually really interested in what, just like how, if we are able to survive, what the culture is gonna learn from what young people are doing in those realms. So that it's kind of easy to say like, well, it's not how it's always been, and so it's not good. But I'm like, well, I was smoking so many cigarettes when I was in my 20s, and like, I don't know, that was my way of handling the lack of connection in my life, or it's like a way to connect with people is to go have a cigarette outside. So I'm like, that's a lot less common. That's positive.
Yeah, what you're saying too about trauma, like I think of trauma as being like, I don't know if this is accurate, but I guess I'm like, a really bad thing could happen to you, and what makes it trauma, I think, is when you're alone in it in a certain way. I mean, I'm sure there's many kinds of trauma that can also happen that are not. But like, I think one thing that I've seen happen to people is like, people didn't believe me, or no one else saw it happening, or I was told it was good for me, something like that. And then I think like that question of, people are breaking that kind of isolation on the internet a lot, like that, this is real. This thing that happened to me is real. Yeah. And I think that's just, and it's really hard to say what this will do. And also, there's no stopping it. It is not happening. So, but I think it's more like maybe the concerns about it are helpful for like self-reflection primarily. Like, what would we want to add in addition to this, or what amount of this feels good for me? Like, given that it also has some downsides.
I know.
Oh, good, I'm glad other people are hearing that.
Yeah.
Is there any other questions before we, yes?
So this might sound simplistic, but it's genuine. I just am not exactly sure how to frame it. If things were better, what would that look like?
I love that question. Yeah, I mean, the world I am picturing is, so I mean, before capitalism, colonialism drastically changed how we lived, mutual aid was how most people lived. Like, basically it was just like, without wage labor, it would just be like, your fence is broken. A bunch of us come help you fix your fence, knowing that in 20 years or 2 years or whatever, you'll, if you can, help fix somebody else's fence, right? Like, people talk about like, gift economy, but it wasn't gift, like I give you this, you give me that. It's like, we're just all trying to survive in this community. We're all trying to keep going and care for each other to the extent we can. It's not as if there was never any violence or never any hierarchy, but nothing like we see now. Nothing like a tiny portion of the world, like, conquering the entire rest of all people for extraction and profit, and for most people's early death. So when I think about like, how do we, if we know people are capable of choosing to organize our lives for the benefit of and well-being of people instead of for the enrichment of a very, very, very small number, we have to obviously dismantle the things that make it the way it is. But I think like one way of thinking about what would it look like if we had lives based in mutual aid, just like in Olympia, is like, right now, like, I have to go to work and make money so that I can pay for like childcare, healthcare, someone to care for my elder, food, a place to live, right? Like, I have to do this. Like, all my time is taken up by this wage job, so I can do those things. And if instead those things are provided in our communities, like, we had a food project that was giving out food, and then we could get that, and I work with other people who are working at, like, we're trying to make a grid that doesn't use any coal or fracking, that's for Olympia, or for just maybe this neighborhood, and then that's how you're getting your energy, and, these people are making clothes, and I've got a kid, so I'm part of the babysitting collective, and then I do 1 day a week, but the other 6 days, people are helping me take care of my kid, so that it's about de-individualizing things. Like, right now, everything's individual, and I think part of that I think is worth thinking about, though it's not for everyone, is that we live more alone than we've ever lived. So like, everyone has a kitchen, and everyone has to have each pot and each pan, and we each make 3 meals a day or whatever if we can. Whereas like, if we all live together, then there'd be like one kitchen, one of each of those things had to be bought ever, and like, if we each made a meal, sometimes I might want to make a meal every 10 days or something. You know what I mean? Like, right, like that, just like the level at which we are being made to have to consume a lot that all costs cash and everything's really expensive, especially housing and healthcare. So like just thinking about what it would be like if we met each other's needs. And I think there's been a million experiments of this, especially, you know, I think you see this in Black and Native communities, but like a million experiments of people being like, we're just gonna make this stuff ourselves because we don't want the systems that are providing it, or they're providing it in a way that's harmful or not providing it to us. But that's what, I mean, a world based in mutual aid would look like that. And I just spent all this time yesterday on this phone call, people trying to make a legal document about some of the things that are dangers of trying to solve problems in your communities without police. So people doing transformative justice work, like, you know, we're trying to have a hotline people can call us at 911, or we're trying to support domestic violence survivors, whatever. And we're like, what are the legal issues? And there's actually like laws in the way of us all doing this, right? There's like, you can't provide childcare unless you have a license. You can't, you know, you can't provide people IVs unless you have a license. Like, there's like things that literally are like it is literally criminal for us to meet our own needs, or the whole history of criminalization of you know, needle exchange, or any number of mutual aid projects. So I think it's useful to think about how badly the system wants us not to just provide it to what we need. And it's useful to think about how, if we were living that way, I might not have everything I need right now. Like, that I think I need right now. Like, I might, you know, people love to have their own bathroom. That just may not be realistic for everybody in this fucking culture to have their own bathroom. You know, or to have bananas all year long, or to have electricity, endless amounts of electricity. I mean, maybe not. You know, most people in the world don't have those things, so the very few can. So I think it's also useful to think, like, it would, but also, like, everything's falling apart. Most people have lost that stuff if they ever had it, and more people are losing all that stuff. So it's a great time to be like, how would we like to live that would be at all sustainable? Like, what would a food system without fossil fuels look like? It would not look like anything like what we're eating now. And if that ends tomorrow, I'm definitely starving to death. I have no backup plan. Most people I know don't. I mean, we can't live in even towns this size and raise enough food and get it here for people to eat. So I think there's just like, the question of how things would look is both this like utopic, wonderful question about sharing and living without the exploitation of wage labor as our main way of getting our needs met. And it's a really profound, terrifying question about the fact that we are living in a very bleak time in which the systems we have come to rely on are falling apart. I think that's a answer. I love the story you told, like people preparing for that on the block or in the community or in the neighborhood, like that's the best way, because then we also want to be like, oh, like you live in a really tiny space, you can't store enough water when the earthquake comes, but I have a huge basement, I'll store water for you too, and for you, you know, like we ideally would share sort of that vulnerability and whatever those security practices are to the extent that they're possible. A good place to end.
Yeah. Thank you so much, everybody.
Thank you.